I came back into the ministry 2 years ago when I started in Vero Beach, Florida. As you guys know, I'm in Brewster, Mass right now. But I had taken a 5-year hiatus. And I really love that congregation in Vero. They're a wonderful congregation. And one of the only problems starting up was my husband, Scott. We have a horse farm in upstate New York. So Scott had to spend about half of the time here in upstate New York because our first kid was going off to college and we had to figure out what to do with the horses while we lived in two places. So he was only down in Florida, as I said, about half the time. Now, knowing that, Reverend Sarah York, who's a colleague of mine, told me to bring down one of my animals. She too had done an interim ministry and she was in London. Her husband was traveling back and forth, and she had wished she had an animal with her because she was extremely lonely. So she said, if you can, Kaaren, bring an animal down. So I brought to Florida my little black cat named Rue. And I brought that little monster with me to church a couple times a week, and she'd walk around the lobby and say hi to people. And those people in Vero extended much love to her and to me. And by the time I left, there were probably 4 or 5 little cat mice left around the office because people would bring them in for the cat to play with. So all of that is to say, Sarah, my colleague, knew that the work itself can be lonely as a minister, but doing it without a spouse with you creates its kind of own isolation, if you will. So I'm lucky to have had Rue, right? Now I know she's an animal, of course, not a person, but she was a good companion. Truth be told, I knew that there would be loneliness, so I was prepared. In fact, I've preached on loneliness many, many times over the years, more so in the last number of years as it's reaching like staggering proportions, actually. And it's become one of the social ills that often goes unnoticed, disregarded, and sadly not well addressed, right? Not just in this country, but all over the world. As more and more people live alone, no longer in a family system, we are less intimately connected to those who know us and see us, those with familial connections. Ironically, actually, with the rise of technology, we are both connected and disconnected. While things like Facebook and Instagram, connect us to friends, we may never meet or rarely see them. It broadens the base, of course, of our connections, but it also gives us a false connection to others. The friendships may be broad, but they are kind of flimsy and thin and often superficial. As one reporter commented, Facebook monetized loneliness. Some people say that the success of social media was a product of an epidemic of loneliness. Some people say it was a contributor to it. Some people say it's the only remedy for it. The latter opinion is usually held by a very few people actually who make money off of things like Facebook and other social media outlets. So I myself, you guys are especially wary of that opinion. And because of this uptick in loneliness, in 2017, the British government declared an epidemic of loneliness, and the UK appointed a minister of loneliness to diagnose the condition. Indeed, before the pandemic, right, there were a number of studies that were conducted on loneliness. So people were asked around the country, tell us how many people you have in your life who you feel really connected to. How many people can you tell your secrets to that you can be vulnerable with? How many people do you have in your life that know you and see you? And it was all these studies point out that a number of years ago, it used to be 6 was the average number of what people had in their life. But when this study was done, even before the pandemic, the average was 1, which I think's a little freaky, because when you think about it, in order to get an average of 1, you had to have a bunch of people answer 0, which is really terrible. The Economist declared loneliness to be the leprosy of the 21st century. And the New Yorker magazine just ran an article called A History of Loneliness, in which the author commented this: loneliness is a vague term. And like all vague terms, it's a cover for all sorts of things most people would rather not name and have no idea how to fix. Plenty of people like to be alone. I myself like to be alone. But solitude and seclusion, which are things I love, are different from loneliness, which is a thing I hate. Loneliness is a state of profound distress. So, all of this is to say, with the pandemic and our social isolation, the disease, if you will, of loneliness has expanded even more. We've got a problem on our hands, friends. And whether we realize it or not, I don't think it's a coincidence that, by the way, with the rise of individualism and individual rights being so harped on right now, that loneliness and the experience of disconnection from others has risen sharply. A number of years ago at our annual meeting, which is kind of ending today, right? Number of years ago, they asked Robert Bellah to come. He was an American sociologist who worked mostly with religions, and he spoke at General Assembly. And while there, he basically pointed out that one of the greatest strengths in our entire culture is the sacredness of the conscience of every individual, that we as a religion and as a country hold individual rights paramount, right? But he stated that in that strength, of course, is always a shadow side. There is always a weakness. When we as a culture put such high praise on individualism, we end up with a populace that is selfish and maladjusted, if you will. A populace who believes that if you can't make it personally, like financially or socially or emotionally, then the fault is on you alone, irregardless of other factors that actually play into it, which serves to separate people, right? Not connect them. It opens up a chasm of despair and angst, and eventually leads to a loneliness that permeates our society. Then he said something, though, that really struck me, and I've held on to this for years and years because it was that profound to me. He told us that this was one of the most formidable issues of American life, and this was years ago. And if we could solve it as a religion ourselves, it might just help us lead the larger society out of the wilderness into which it has wandered. And it was there that he actually asked us to do something. He encouraged us to take our first principle of faith, right, which is the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And he encouraged us to flip it with our last one. Now, this is before the 8th one came, right? So he was talking about the 7th principle, which is respect for the interdependent web of which we are all a part. He told us to flip them. So you have interdependence as first. When you think about the principles, they basically are what 2 denominations that merged in the 1970s could agree upon. Truthfully, that is a pretty low baseline of who it is that we are and what we are called to do in the world. And so his call to flip-flop them made me wonder, right? Whether or not there was a lot of thought around what became the first principle, the second principle, the third principle, We all know that when things are listed first on a list, in a phone book, in a roster, our human brains make that first thing most important than anything that follows. Bella was saying that the only real hope for the country isn't just to commit to a collective, it's to commit to change the narrative, the numbering, the importance. To heal the isolation and loneliness takes flipping of its importance. It takes living in the plural rather than the singular. And after reading all of that and thinking through Bella's flipping and what our call is, I remembered something that happened to me once. So I think I've told you, I used to be the called minister in Rochester, New York. And one day I got this call from a parishioner that told me that our past social justice coordinator, who hadn't been at the church for a long time and hadn't been a member, was in the hospital with cancer and she was dying. And this parishioner asked me if I would go to the hospital and see Sonia. And I said, yeah, of course I will. So I go up to the hospital and I get there, and you know how they have those nurses stations right outside so you can ask where somebody's room is. And I asked the nurse where Sonia's room was, and she said, it's right there. But by the way, I'm so glad that you're here. And I thought that was curious. But then I walked into Sonia's room. There were no personal effects in that room, not a thing, no cards, no flowers, no pictures, no nothing. And there was Sonia sitting on the bed, which honestly, she kind of looked like a doll that somebody had pulled all the hair out of. She maybe had 5 or 6 strands of hair on a bald head, and she was sitting in a room, in a dark room, not doing anything except focusing on breathing. And she had a mask over her face. So I walk in and I reintroduced myself to her, and I sat down at the edge of the bed, and right away she knew exactly who I was, and she kind of perked up a little bit. And then she took the mask off and she said, could you give me a hug? And I was like, well, of course I can. Yeah, no problem. So I tried to hug her with the mask off, and I put my arms around, but there's all these tubes coming out of her and around her, and she started coughing like frantically. She could not get a breath. So she had to put the mask back on, which made it impossible to give her a hug. So I really didn't know this woman that well. And I did a little bit of small talk, which felt like at her, right? And then I tried again. She took the mask off. I tried to give her a hug. She started coughing uncontrollably again, and she started crying, and she put the mask back on. I maybe stayed for another 5 more minutes. I didn't really know what to do, and I felt terrible. And I left. And as I went to the nurse's station, I asked the nurse, I said, is there some reason that there are no like personal effects in her room? And she said, no, I really mean it. You are the only one that has come to see her. And I'm so glad you are here. So I remember walking to the parking lot and feeling, I've often thought about that feeling. I think I felt lost. That's really the best way I know how to describe it. Because it occurred to me in the parking lot, I could have climbed into the bed and sat next to her. Not in front of her on the bed, but next to her. I could have sat beside her and put my arm around her so that she felt like I was giving her a hug. Just be present with her physically as she had asked for. I could have done something odd to make it not odd. So for years, that's probably 15 years ago at least, I go back to that one occasion and I think through what I did, not with a sense of guilt really, but with a certain kind of regret, honestly. Here, I was presented with profound loneliness and isolation, and I didn't know how to respond. Not that long ago, I read this blog by this woman named Glennon Doyle. Her blog's called Momastery. Anyway, she tells this story about her son Chase, who is in elementary school, and he is learning the new way to do long division, which is she didn't understand, right? If you have seen any of this, it's a completely different way of doing long division. Anyway, she calls up the teacher and she says, we could use some help. And the teacher says, well, if Chase needs help, you just bring him in and I'll help him out. And she says, no. Chase doesn't need help. I don't understand how to do this, so I can't even help him with it. If he needs help, could I come in and you could teach me what, you're doing? So the teacher says, yeah, of course. And so she goes in and she, sits with the teacher. She learns how to do this new way of long division. And then she and the teacher start talking. And the teacher at one point explains to her that in her opinion, teacher isn't necessarily having kids learn reading and writing, but actually producing children who are brave and kind. And that for her, that is the larger responsibility. And then this teacher went on to explain that every Friday afternoon, she asked all the students in the class to write on a piece of paper 4 names of kids that they would like to sit next to in the next week, and ask them to recommend one kid who has been the standout in the classroom. So each child every Friday, right? Like they write these names down. They have the answer to her question, and then they hand them into the teacher in confidence. Nobody else has seen them except the teacher. And when those kids leave on Friday, she takes those notes, spreads them out on her desk, and she tells Glennon that she is looking for patterns. Who isn't being requested by anyone else? Who doesn't even know what to request? Who never gets noticed enough to be noticed? Glennon said this: Chase's teacher is not looking for a new seating chart or exceptional citizens. Chase's teacher is looking for lonely children. She's looking for children who are struggling to connect with other children. She's identifying the little ones who are falling through the cracks of the class's social life and discovering whose gifts are being unnoticed by their peers. Glennon asked the teacher when she started doing that. And she said she started doing it the week after Columbine. Glennon commented, she said this: to see this brilliant teacher watching what happened at Columbine, knowing that all violence begins with disconnection. All outward violence begins as an inner loneliness. She watched that tragedy knowing that children who aren't being noticed, whose seeds are left unnoticed and untended to by others, will eventually resort to being noticed by any means available to them, often in very, very destructive ways. She gets that even love, even belonging has a pattern to it. And she finds those patterns through her lists. She breaks a code of disconnection, and then she gets lonely kids the help that they need. It's math to her. All love is math. Here's the thing. I absolutely love that story, because it not only reminds us to pay attention to others, especially when they may be most vulnerable, but it also reminds us to look out for one another. I think it's telling, by the way, that in the US in 2020, we experienced the largest ever recorded annual increase in murders It was a rise of 30%. It was the biggest jump in 6 decades. But if you think about it, it makes sense. Because with the continued rise of individual rights over the collective and a year and a half of a pandemic, is it any surprise that given our isolation and loneliness, the murder rate is at its highest over the last 6 decades? That's huge. And as I've wrestled with remembering Sonia and reading that blog post, I've been pushing myself to go further. I do think there is more than this, than just paying attention to others, really. Reaching out and connecting to those who may be vulnerable amongst us, inside and outside of our walls. And when I push myself, it wasn't actually that I forgot to get in bed with Sonia. It's that it would have been very odd to do so. It would have been messy, right? As in, how do I go about having that conversation with her? It would have been an uncomfortable human interaction. She may have thought I was a little, well, I don't know, strange. I may have embarrassed myself. I may have looked like the fool. But here's the thing, in truth, if we are ever going to really address loneliness, we are going to have to sometimes sacrifice our own comfort, our own, I can't do that moment, and get over ourselves. Because the relationships are messy, right? Connecting with other human beings, I don't know, it's messy. Things don't always go right. People don't always respond the way that we want them to. And more often than not, we convince ourselves that what others think of us is more important than doing the right thing. We convince ourselves. I get that. But I think I've learned that it just might be worth it. If you knew, right? If you knew that you could connect with one more person and make them feel loved and cared for, known and seen, if you could help abate their loneliness, wouldn't you sacrifice just a little of your usual self-reserve or patterns or behaviors that feel proper and put together to actually reach out to another to save them from being lonely? I think I've learned that it's worth the risk. Again, I don't have guilt about Sonia as much as I regret I didn't do what felt right in my gut, even if it would have felt weird to everyone around me. You know, like the nurse or an orderly that came in, or maybe even her. But I know that now, that I would have done the right thing to abate her loneliness. I don't think I fully understood that at the time, but I do now, and I vowed not to make the same mistake. So friends, by the way, Robert Bella, who I was talking about earlier, right? He spoke at General Assembly in 1998. That was like over 25 years ago. And the loneliness clarion call hadn't reached epidemic proportions yet. The problem was kind of like emerging, growing even, but the consequences of not doing it weren't really life and death. Our denomination never switched the order of the principles. But perhaps just yesterday, they've done something better. As you likely know, the Article 2 vote at General Assembly passed. It is not a replacement of the 7 principles, but an augmentation of them, a turning, if you will, from principles at the center of our faith to values. So I find it helpful actually to think of values like this. Values are part of an internal system that guides behavior, whereas principles are external. We have for years said we are about deeds, not creeds, about like living and loving in the world. That's more important to us. More important than I often say, like, we're about living well in this life rather than worrying about the next, right? This Article 2 business gets us one step closer. There are 6 values around one unifying value of love. And what I am actually super excited about is the independence aspect isn't one of the values, but interdependence is. Finally, in a sense, we've flipped the principles. There's a hurting world out there, my friends, that needs people who pay attention to those who are isolated, people who aren't afraid to sacrifice for the good of another's well-being and wholeness. Interdependence is needed now more than ever. So may that be our calling and our cry, and I do mean cry in all of its myriad ways. It is a cry that needs everything that we have to give to it today and this day forward. May it be so. Amen.